One of the most exciting moments in any gardener's life must be when they create a new garden or renovate an existing one. But whichever you do, there is a fundamental step that you must undertake, and that is a site analysis. This means you've got to think about exposure to climate, to sun, to rain, and to wind. You've got to think about which elements of the existing garden you want to keep. It may be paving or trees. You've got to think about site soils and view lines, and even subtle things like exposure to noise from a road. If you fail to understand those different components of your garden, then your design can be doomed to failure. So today, let's look at a garden where a good site analysis really paid dividends. When the owners first came to this bayside property in Melbourne, both the front and the rear gardens were built around lawns and predominantly exotic plants. This still works well in the back garden, where the house and surrounding properties provide shelter from the wind and the western sun. But in the front garden, things weren't quite so harmonious. The garden is over the road from the beach, and it faces southwest, where it cops all of those strong, salt-laden, hot summer winds. So a cypress hedge here was planted to screen that and to reduce the wind speed. Well, in fact, it didn't seem to work so well, but worst of all, the cypress roots permeated the garden and removed all the moisture, making it really tough to grow any other plants. So the cypresses had to go. And when the cypress trees were replaced by this wall, it provided good security, opened up extensive views over the coastal areas, as well as providing a link to the house and a unifying element for the whole of the garden. But sometimes your site analysis will tell you there are things you should keep in your garden, so be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In this case, for example, the garden was created in 3 levels. They worked really well, and they were nicely proportioned for the size of the garden, so they in fact have been retained, together with much of the masonry, for example the steps that link those terraces. But there are changes. Here at the base, for example, a pond has been introduced. This is a wonderful spot for rest and relaxation, perhaps a place to read a book, but it's also a focus to the diagonal line running right the way through the garden, and a wonderful haven for local wildlife. One part of the original garden that wasn't kept was the lawn, and I reckon that's great because, of course, that has a high water demand, but also it wouldn't have suited this wonderful assemblage of low water plants. Compacted gravel, by contrast, is really great because the water can be shed onto the planting areas. Now, when it comes to lawn, you could put in steppers through it, and that would be quite acceptable, but you wouldn't dream of planting plants like this Dianella into a lawn. With gravels, you can not only put paving through to create pattern, but you can plant plants into it too to create magical little motifs. And what I particularly like are the way in which these leaves of the Dianella sweep across the gravel to create really quite charming and subtle patterns. Grasses and grass-like plants do make a major contribution to this garden, and this sterile pennisetum with these rather coppery purpley flowers and leaves is really a great favourite of mine. Throughout the garden, grasses have been used to give texture, and it really is predominantly a garden of textures. Another of my favourite plantings is this exquisite eucalyptus, Eucalyptus cassia subspecies magna, better known as Silver Princess. It's native to the West Australian sandbelt, and these soils here, which are really quite open sandy soils, suit it perfectly. Now it's thriving here, even tolerating the salt winds. The exposed site is perfect for this dry, mostly native garden, which now it's established, survives on available rainfall. There's a lot to like about this garden. I particularly like the informality of the grasses, and I think the gravel works particularly well with that. I also like this cross-axis framed by the arbour clad in that lovely little native climber purple appleberry. But what is really important is that the owners sat down with their designer and clarified their needs. The designer then did a thorough site analysis, so they really understood the site. and they prepared a design that is attractive, effective, and thoroughly appropriate for the site.